Number 1. Water tortillas with lard and salt. No broth. No milk. No eggs. Just masa harina, water, a little lard if there was lard, salt. She made them every morning from the same ingredients and the same proportions because the proportions were not a recipe, they were the minimum required to make something that held together on the comal and could be eaten without anything on top if necessary and with whatever existed if something existed. On the mornings when there was nothing else, the tortilla with lard and salt was breakfast and lunch and sometimes dinner. On the mornings when there was one egg or a spoonful of beans, the tortilla became a delivery mechanism for something larger than itself. She never presented it as deprivation. She set it on the table warm, folded in the cloth she had been using for 20 years, and let the warmth of it make its own argument. A warm tortilla on a cold morning is not nothing. It is, in fact, a very specific kind of everything, the kind that requires only flour and water and heat and someone who got up before you did to make it. The lard gave it fat and the fat gave it staying power and the staying power got the children to school and the men to the fields and the women through the morning and into the afternoon where the next problem was already waiting to be solved. You waited without thinking about what it had cost to make. You waited without thinking about the hours she had gotten up to make it. You ate it and left and she made more and you never once counted how many she had made in a lifetime and how many mornings she had stood at that comal before the sun came up making the simplest things so that the day could begin. The number is too large to say out loud. It would take too long. And she would tell you not to bother counting. Number 2. Bean soup with 1 dried chili. 1 chili. Not because that was the recipe, because that was what was left. The dried chili de arbol or the ancho or the pasilla, whichever variety had survived longest in the paper bag she kept in the back of the cabinet, toasted on the dry comal until it softened and darkened and released its smell into the kitchen, then torn into pieces and added to the bean pot. The beans had been soaking since the night before, pinto or black or whatever was cheapest at the market that week. Cooked low and slow in water with a piece of onion and the chili and whatever herb existed, epazote if she grew it, cilantro if she didn't. The broth that resulted from hours of this process was not thin. It was deep and brown and tasted like it had more in it than it did, because the chili had done what dried chiles do. Expanded everything around them, made the water taste like it had always been broth, made the beans taste like they had been cooked with meat even when there was no meat and had not been meat for 2 weeks. She knew what the chili could do. She used it the way a painter uses a single strong color, sparingly, precisely, in the place where it would do the most work. She had 1 chili and she used it completely, extracted every unit of flavor it contained, left nothing in it when she was done. That is not poverty cooking. That is mastery. That is knowing your materials so well that you can get from them what no one else would think to ask. Number 3. Egg and potato, the meal that stretched furthest. 2 eggs. 3 potatoes. 1 chili. Enough for 5 people if she was careful, and she was always careful, had been careful so long that careful had stopped feeling like constraint and started feeling like skill, which is what it was. The potatoes boiled first until just soft, then cut into pieces and added to the pan where the chili had already been toasting in a little lard, then the eggs cracked over everything and scrambled in, the heat lowered so the egg cooked slowly through the potato rather than sitting on top of it, becoming something integrated, something where you could not take a bite of just egg or just potato but only the thing they had become together. She served it with tortillas and nothing else and it fed the family and nobody left the table hungry and nobody mentioned that there had only been 2 eggs and nobody mentioned the potatoes. They ate what was in front of them and they were grateful in the way people are grateful when the alternative is visible and close and real. The food tasted good because she had made it taste good from almost nothing, which is a different kind of cooking than making something taste good from abundance. It is harder. It requires more knowledge. It produces, sometimes, better results. You did not know any of this when you were eating it. You just knew it was good. You know now why it was good. The why is her. Number 4. Corn gruel with piloncillo. The corn masa dissolved in water and cooked until thick, sweetened with whatever sugar existed. Piloncillo if there was piloncillo, plain sugar if there wasn't, nothing if there was neither, and the sweetness had to come from the cinnamon she added instead, which gave the impression of sweetness without the cost of it. She made it for breakfast on the coldest mornings and for dinner on the nights when there was nothing else, and for the children when they were sick and needed something warm that would not ask anything of a compromised stomach. The consistency she aimed for was between thin and thick, thin enough to drink, thick enough to feel like a meal, a balance she achieved by adding the masa slowly and stirring continuously and adjusting as she went, never measuring, because measuring implies quantities that can be relied upon, and in those years the quantities could not be relied upon. What could be relied upon was her judgment, her hands, her knowledge of what the mixture looked like at the right moment, her willingness to stand at the stove stirring something that cost almost nothing until it became something worth eating. She stirred it the same way every time. Clockwise, slowly, without stopping, watching the surface for the moment it changed. That moment was different every batch depending on the heat and the masa and the water and the altitude and 20 other variables she had internalized so completely that she no longer thought about them. She just knew. Knowing without thinking is what 30 years of practice produces. She had been practicing since she was 9 years old, standing next to her own mother at a different stove in a different kitchen in a different country that was also running low on everything and also needed someone to stand at the stove and stir. Number 5. Cactus with chili and lime. The cactus grew wild in places. It grew in yards and along roads and in lots where nothing else had been planted and nobody had thought to tend it. She gathered it herself when she could not afford to buy it, carrying a cloth and a knife, choosing the younger pads that were more tender, avoiding the older ones that had grown thick and fibrous and required more preparation than the younger ones rewarded. At home she cleaned them on the table, the spines removed with the knife in quick practice strokes, the pads sliced thin, blanched in salted water to reduce the slime, drained and cooled and dressed with lime and chili and a little salt. The result was something that tasted bright and slightly tart and deeply green and nothing like what it had cost to make. On a plate next to the bean soup or the egg and potato it looked like abundance. It provided what the rest of the meal didn't: acid, texture, something fresh in a diet that was otherwise heavy and brown and built for survival rather than pleasure. She understood that pleasure matters even when survival is the primary concern. Especially then. A meal without something fresh is a meal that announces its own scarcity. She refused to announce it. She put the cactus on the plate instead and let the brightness of it say what she would not say: that she had thought about this meal, that she had considered what it needed, that she had gone out and gathered something from the side of the road to make it complete, that even on the days when the pantry had almost nothing she was not making do. She was cooking. There is a difference. Number 6. Bone broth soup with whatever vegetables remained. She kept every bone. This is the rule that those kitchens ran on: nothing that could give more was allowed to stop giving. The chicken bones from Sunday went into a pot with water on Monday. The beef bone from the soup 2 weeks ago, cracked to expose the marrow, went in with them. Simmered for hours, skimmed, strained, returned to the pot with whatever vegetables had made it to the end of the week. The carrot that was going soft, the zucchini that had a bruise she cut around, the corn cob stripped of its kernels for another dish, now added whole to the broth for what remained in it. The result smelled like abundance. It tasted like a household that had more than it did. She served it with tortillas and did not call it bone soup. She called it caldo, which is just the Spanish word for broth but which carries within it the history of every woman who had ever stood over a pot of bones and water and willed it into something worth eating. She added that will every time. It was the ingredient that cost nothing and changed everything. When the broth was ready she tasted it with a spoon and adjusted the salt and tasted it again and sometimes added nothing more and sometimes added a dried chili torn into pieces and dropped directly into the pot for the last 20 minutes and sometimes added a handful of whatever herb existed and sometimes left it exactly as it was because it was already what it needed to be. She knew. She always knew. That knowing was worth more than any ingredient she could have added. You cannot buy that knowing. You can only inherit it by standing close enough, long enough, paying attention when you were young enough that the attention became part of you before you knew you were being shaped.